You're a 19-year-old Marine? It's 1945. You've just fought your way across a Pacific island drenched in blood. And now your sergeant is ordering you to descend into a hole in the ground. No map. No idea what's waiting. Just darkness and the faint sound of breathing that isn't yours. What those soldiers found in the tunnels beneath Okinawa would make grown men weep 60 years later. And I'm about to take you down there with them. But first, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear is not in your history textbooks. This is the story they don't want you to know. 1945, the doorstep to mainland Japan, the final barrier before an invasion that could cost 1 million American lives. Japanese commanders knew what was coming. And they made a choice that would turn this tropical paradise into something out of Dante's Inferno. They didn't just fortify the island, they hollowed it out. Turned it inside out, made it swallow its own people whole. Think about that for a second. An entire island transformed into a trap. But the trap wasn't just for the Americans. It was for everyone who set foot on Okinawa. Soldier and civilian alike, Japanese and Okinawan. All of them would descend into the earth, and many would never emerge. The limestone was perfect. Soft enough to carve with hand tools, hard enough to withstand naval bombardment. And so began one of history's most horrifying construction projects. But here's what they don't tell you who actually built these tunnels. Students. Barely teenagers, their hands bleeding from chisel work. Elderly farmers forced to dig until their hearts gave out. Entire families, parents and children together, carving their own tombs and calling them shelters. One survivor described the sound, thousands of picks striking stone in unison, echoing through the hills like a massive clock counting down to doomsday. Day after day, week after week, the dust was so thick that workers coughed up blood. The heat so intense that men collapsed and were simply dragged aside. No breaks, no mercy. Because mercy was a luxury Okinawa could no longer afford. The construction went on for months, winter turned to spring, and still the digging continued. Workers developed calluses that split open and bled, only to harden again. Some lost fingers to the tools. Others went blind from the limestone dust. But the work never stopped, because Japanese military engineers had a vision, and that vision required sacrifice on a scale that defied imagination. But these weren't just caves. Oh no. Japanese engineers designed something far more sinister. Imagine walking through a labyrinth where every turn could be your last. Command centers with phone lines connecting to observation posts on the surface. Ammunition rooms with blast doors designed to channel explosions. Infirmaries carved into rock that would soon run red with blood. And crawl spaces, narrow passages designed specifically to funnel American soldiers into kill zones, where they'd die in the dark, unable to even raise their rifles. The crown jewel was beneath Shuri Castle, an underground fortress capable of holding thousands, wired for communication, stocked with supplies. From here, General Ushijima would orchestrate a defense so fanatical it would cost over 100,000 lives. His officers lived underground for weeks at a time, planning every detail of the coming battle. They studied maps by lantern light. They calculated ammunition needs. They designated which tunnels would be hospitals, which would be armories, and which would be mass graves. But here's the twisted part. The deeper they dug, the more they sealed their own fate. Because these tunnels had a secret. They weren't designed to protect life. They were designed to prolong death, to make the Americans pay for every inch of ground with rivers of blood. To buy time for the homeland, even if it meant sacrificing every soul on Okinawa. The engineers understood the psychology of tunnel warfare. They knew that Americans were trained for open combat, for charging beaches and assaulting hills. But fighting in darkness, in confined spaces where every shadow could conceal death, that was something else entirely. That was a descent into primal fear. And the Japanese planned to exploit that fear until it broke the American will to fight. By April 1945, Okinawa wasn't an island anymore. It was an organism. A living, breathing trap with arteries of stone and chambers that pulsed with fear. Every hill concealed an entrance. Every valley hid a firing position. And waiting in the darkness were 110,000 Japanese soldiers and 300,000 civilians who had been told one terrifying lie. The Americans will torture you. They will mutilate your children. Death is better than surrender. Can you imagine believing that? Can you imagine being so terrified of the enemy above that you'd rather die in the dark below? This wasn't just military propaganda. This was psychological warfare turned inward, weaponizing the population's own fear against them. Officers held meetings in village squares describing in graphic detail what Americans supposedly did to prisoners. They showed fabricated photographs. They told stories of atrocities that never happened. And slowly, methodically, they convinced an entire population that capture meant something worse than death. Families made pacts. If the Americans came, they would die together. Fathers instructed their sons on how to use grenades. Mothers prepared vials of poison and hid them in their clothing. Children as young as 8 were taught that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, that dying for the emperor was the highest honor a Japanese citizen could achieve. The stage was set. The trap was ready, and the Americans had no idea what they were walking into. Intelligence reports suggested Okinawa would be heavily defended, but nothing could have prepared them for what lay beneath the surface. Nothing could have warned them that they were about to fight an enemy that had literally gone underground, that had transformed an entire island into a weapon, and that was willing to sacrifice everything, everyone, to stop the American advance. April 1st, 1945. The Americans called it Love Day, the day they would invade Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. Battleships hurled shells the size of refrigerators. Aircraft dropped bombs until the beaches looked like the surface of the moon. The bombardment was so intense that soldiers on ships miles away had to cover their ears. The noise was deafening, a continuous thunder that seemed to shake the very ocean. And then the Marines landed. Thousands of them, expecting to fight their way off the beaches against withering fire. They'd rehearsed this moment for weeks. They knew their casualty rates would be horrific. Some had written final letters home before boarding the landing craft. Others clutched photographs of loved ones, convinced they'd never see them again. But when they hit the beaches, they found nothing. Empty trenches, abandoned villages. Not a single shot fired. For a brief, beautiful moment, some soldiers thought maybe, just maybe, this would be easy. Maybe the bombardment had done its job. Maybe the Japanese had retreated to the northern part of the island. Maybe, for once, they'd catch a break. They were wrong. So terribly, terribly wrong. It started with a sound, a whistling from the hillsides. Then the ground erupted. Mortars fell like rain from positions that moments before had seemed like ordinary hills. Machine gunfire spat from holes in the rock. Entire squads were cut down before they could even identify where the shooting was coming from. Men who'd survived the landing, who'd thought they were safe, suddenly found themselves dying on ground they'd taken without a fight. And then the Americans understood. They weren't fighting on Okinawa. They were fighting inside it. The island itself had become the enemy. Every hill, every ridge, every innocent-looking slope concealed a weapon aimed at their hearts. The Japanese hadn't retreated. They'd simply disappeared beneath the surface, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. One Marine described it like this. It was like the island was alive and angry. Like we'd woken up something that had been sleeping under the earth, and now it wanted us dead. Another soldier wrote home, "We're not fighting an army anymore. We're fighting ghosts. They're everywhere and nowhere. You clear a position, turn your back, and suddenly it's firing again. It's driving us mad." The Americans had a name for the tunnel entrances, rat holes. But that term doesn't capture the horror. Because rats can be exterminated, these tunnels, they were infinite. Seal a one entrance with explosives? The defenders would emerge from another opening 50 yards away. Clear a hill at dawn, by dusk it would be firing again. Throw grenades into a cave, listen to the screams echo through passages that seem to go on forever, and then watch as soldiers emerged from a completely different entrance to counterattack. The fighting became a nightmare of repetition. Take a hill, lose men, secure it, lose more men. Turn to advance to the next objective, and the hill you just took opens fire on your back. It was maddening, psychologically devastating. Soldiers began to question whether they were making any progress at all, or if they were just dying in the same places over and over again. And then came the moment every soldier dreaded, the order to go inside, to descend into the tunnels and clear them by hand. Because artillery couldn't reach underground, airstrikes were useless. The only way to truly secure a position was to go into the darkness and fight the enemy on their terms in their territory where every advantage belonged to them. Imagine yourself there. You're gripping your rifle so hard your knuckles are white. Your flashlight beam cuts through darkness so thick it feels solid. The air is hot, suffocating, laced with smoke from the flamethrower your buddy just used to clear the entrance. Every breath tastes like death, like sulfur and cordite and something else, something organic and rotting that you try not to think about. You take a step forward. The tunnel narrows. You're crouching now, then crawling. Your helmet scrapes the ceiling, sending small cascades of limestone dust into your eyes. You blink, trying to clear your vision, but you can't wipe your face because your hands are full, one holding your rifle, the other holding the flashlight that's the only thing keeping you from complete, absolute darkness. And somewhere ahead in the darkness beyond your light, you hear breathing. Or do you? Is it your imagination? Is it your own heart pounding in your ears so loudly it sounds like someone else? Or is someone waiting just around the next corner with a bayonet, with a grenade, with a rifle aimed at the exact spot where your head will appear? You don't know. You can't know. And that's what makes it unbearable. The not knowing. The absolute certainty that death could come at any second, from any direction, and you'll never see it coming. Marines called it fighting in coffins. The Japanese had designed these tunnels to neutralize every American advantage. No artillery support underground, no airstrikes, no tanks, no overwhelming firepower. Just man against man in spaces so tight you couldn't even swing a rifle. You had to fire from the hip or use pistols, or in the tightest spaces, knives and entrenching tools and bare hands. The combat was primal, brutal, terrifying. Gunfire in confined spaces was so loud it ruptured eardrums. Men went deaf firing their own weapons, the muzzle blast in an enclosed tunnel creating pressure waves that damaged their hearing permanently. Smoke from grenades turned oxygen into poison. You'd throw a grenade around a corner, wait for the explosion, then try to advance through smoke so thick you literally couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Flamethrowers became the weapon of choice, but they came with their own horror. The fire sucked oxygen from chambers, consuming the air itself. Men emerged from these fights deaf, blind, choking, traumatized beyond anything their training had prepared them for. Some suffered psychological breaks, refusing to go underground again even under threat of court-martial. Others became addicted to the adrenaline, volunteering for every tunnel-clearing mission, convinced that the only way to deal with the fear was to face it again and again until either they died or the war ended. One sergeant later confessed, "I killed men in the dark whose faces I never saw. I heard them die, heard them scream, heard them pray in Japanese, but I never saw their faces, and that's what haunts me. Not what I did, but what I didn't see. Because in my mind, they could be anyone. They could be me. They could be my brother. They're just voices in the dark, voices that went silent because I pulled a trigger." The Japanese fought with the desperation of men who knew they'd never leave this island alive. They'd emerge from hidden doors, strike with precision, then vanish back underground before Americans could respond. They'd wait in the darkness for hours, days even, for the perfect moment to attack. Some defenders went without food for weeks, surviving on rainwater that seeped through cracks in the limestone and whatever rats they could catch in the tunnels. The discipline was inhuman. American patrols would enter tunnels they thought were cleared, only to be ambushed by soldiers who'd been hiding in side passages for days, waiting in complete silence, not moving, barely breathing, until the perfect moment to strike. The patience required for that kind of warfare is difficult to comprehend. To sit in absolute darkness, hungry, thirsty, terrified, and wait. Just wait for the enemy to drop their guard for just 1 second. Some soldiers were found weeks later, still alive, hiding in collapsed sections, drinking their own urine to survive, still clutching weapons they were too weak to fire. When American search teams discovered them, they'd often refuse to surrender, choosing to detonate grenades rather than face capture. The Americans expected an army. What they found was something more disturbing. 110,000 men who had made a pact with death itself, who had crossed a psychological threshold from which there was no return. But soldiers weren't the only ones trapped underground. And what the Americans discovered next would prove that the true horror of Okinawa wasn't the military resistance. It was what had been done to the innocent. It was the realization that this war had consumed not just soldiers, but entire families, entire communities, entire generations. Now, pause for a moment. Forget the soldiers, forget the military strategy, because what I'm about to tell you is going to make you angry, furious even. It's going to make you question everything you thought you knew about the Pacific War. Entire Okinawan villages were forced underground. Not soldiers, not combatants. Families, elderly people who could barely walk, pregnant women, children who should have been playing in schoolyards, learning to read, living normal lives, all herded into the tunnels like cattle, told they'd be safe beneath the stone. Told that the American bombardment would pass over them. Told that when the battle ended, they could return to their homes and resume their lives. They carried everything they owned. Bedding rolled into tight bundles. Family heirlooms wrapped in cloth. Photos of ancestors, the most precious possessions they had. Down into caverns already choked with smoke and sweat and the smell of fear. Down into darkness that seemed to have no bottom, and then the entrances were sealed. And the reality struck. There was no air circulation, no sanitation, no escape. They were trapped, imprisoned by their own military, protected by walls that had become their cage. Imagine being trapped underground with your family. No sunlight. You lose track of time. Is it day? Is it night? Has it been hours or days since you descended? No fresh air. The oxygen grows stale, thick, hard to breathe, no escape. Artillery shaking the earth above you, raining dust onto your children's heads, and you're trying to keep your infant from crying because the soldiers sharing your cave have warned you. One sound could give away our position. One cry could bring death raining down on all of us. Mothers rocked babies for hours, their arms aching, their backs screaming in pain, whispering lullabies to keep them calm. The same songs their mothers had sung to them, the same melodies that had comforted generations of Okinawan children. But now those songs were sung in darkness, in fear, in desperation. Children scratched messages into the limestone walls, crude prayers to ancestors they'd never meet, begging for protection that would never come. Please help us. I want to go home. I'm scared. Simple words carved by small hands, messages that wouldn't be discovered until decades later when archaeologists explored the tunnels and found these heartbreaking testimonies preserved in stone. Old men who'd spent their lives farming in the sun, who'd known every inch of their land, who'd planted rice and sweet potatoes and watched their children grow, now withered in darkness, wondering if they'd ever see daylight again. Some went blind from the darkness, their eyes losing the ability to process light after weeks underground. Others lost their minds, unable to cope with the sensory deprivation and constant fear. The soldiers treated them as expendable, rations seized for the garrison. The military took food that was meant for civilian families and redistributed it to fighting units. When families protested, they were told this was their patriotic duty. Men forced to dig new chambers until their hands were bloody stumps, their fingernails torn off from clawing at rock. And girls as young as 14, pressed into service as nurses, carrying messages through suffocating passageways, tending to wounds they'd never been trained to treat, seeing horrors that would destroy their innocence forever. But here's where it gets truly evil. The Japanese military had spent months spreading lies, vicious, calculated propaganda designed to weaponize fear. They told civilians that Americans were monsters, demons in human form, that they'd torture women, mutilate children, desecrate bodies. They described these supposed atrocities in graphic detail, painting pictures so vivid and horrible that they branded themselves into the imagination of every civilian who heard them. If you surrender, the officer said, they will do things to you that are worse than death. They will violate your women in front of you. They will kill your children slowly. They will make you watch. And then they will kill you too. But only after they've broken your spirit completely. And the civilians believe them. Why wouldn't they? These were their own officers, their own military, their own government. Why would they lie? Parents repeated these lies to their children until everyone was convinced that capture meant horror beyond imagination. They trembled at the very thought of daylight because they associated it with American soldiers and the horrors they'd been told to expect. Think about that level of manipulation. These people were more afraid of rescue than they were of dying in the dark. They would rather suffocate in tunnels, would rather starve, would rather die than face what they believed awaited them on the surface. That's not just propaganda. That's psychological warfare of the most insidious kind. As the weeks dragged on, conditions became intolerable. sawed through bone while patients were held down by nurses who were themselves just teenage girls, pressed into service from Okinawan schools, collapsing from exhaustion, their hands trembling as they tried to help, as they tried to comfort men who were experiencing pain beyond human comprehension. The screams, oh God, the screams, they echoed through the tunnels so loudly that guards stuffed rags in their ears just to maintain their sanity. Some guards developed psychological breaks, unable to cope with the constant sound of agony. The screams would start as a man was brought in for surgery, build to a crescendo as the saw bit into bone, and then slowly fade to whimpers and finally silence. And then another patient would be brought in, and it would start again. Nurses, many of them students who should have been studying literature or mathematics, who should have been worried about exams and crushes and what they'd do after graduation, instead wore uniforms stiff with dried blood. Their hands shook as they tried to sterilize instruments over open flames, knowing the effort was futile, knowing that infection would kill most of their patients anyway, but doing it because it was the only thing they could do, the only way to maintain the illusion that they were helping. The air was a poisonous mixture of pus, sweat, and smoke. Flies swarmed untreated wounds in clouds so thick you could hear the buzzing, a constant drone that mixed with the moans of the dying. Maggots infested living flesh, eating away at soldiers who were too weak to brush them off, who lay there feeling insects burrow into their bodies while they waited for death. Amputated limbs piled in corners like discarded logs because there was nowhere to dispose of them. Arms and legs, some still wearing boots or clutching weapons, stacked in heaps that grew higher every day. Some nurses had to step over them to reach patients. The smell of gangrene and rot was overwhelming, a physical presence that made breathing an ordeal. And the dying begged for mercy that couldn't be granted. They begged for morphine that didn't exist. They begged to be taken outside, to see the sky one last time, but moving them would have killed them faster. They begged their comrades to end their suffering, but their comrades had orders to save every soldier possible, no matter the cost. Here's something that will stick with you. Some soldiers clutched grenades and pleaded with doctors to let them die by their own hand, rather than linger in agony. They'd pull doctors close, whisper through cracked lips swollen with dehydration. Please, just let me go outside. Let me take one American with me. Don't make me die slowly in here. Let me die like a soldier, not like this, not rotting in the dark. And the doctors refused. Not because they were cruel, but because they had orders. Every soldier was to be kept alive as long as possible, to defend the island, to kill more Americans, to buy more time. It didn't matter if those soldiers were too wounded to fight, too infected to live more than a few days. The orders were clear, so men who could have been granted merciful deaths instead lingered for days or weeks, suffering beyond anything their commanders would ever understand or care about. Others prayed aloud, their chants echoing through the chambers until they were drowned out by the thunder of artillery overhead. Buddhist prayers, Shinto prayers, personal prayers to family members they'd never see again. The hospitals shook with every bombardment. Dust and rock fell into open wounds. Sterile procedures became impossible. Infection was guaranteed. Doctors operated knowing their patients would die anyway, but they operated because not operating meant giving up, meant admitting defeat, and they weren't allowed to do that. When American troops broke into these chambers, even hardened combat veterans were stunned into silence. Men who'd seen the worst of Pacific combat, who'd fought on Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Saipan, stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. They found bodies stacked beside the living, corpses and dying men mixed together because there was no room to separate them. Mouths frozen in silent screams, faces contorted in expressions of agony that death hadn't softened. Surgeons' notebooks lay scattered, pages filled with bloodstains and desperate notes about supplies that never arrived. One American medic picked up a notebook and tried to read it even though he didn't speak Japanese. Later, a translator would read those pages and break down crying. The entries were heartbreaking. Send morphine scrawled in Japanese, the characters increasingly desperate and sloppy as the surgeon's hands shook from exhaustion. Patient died during amputation. No anesthesia available. He was 20 years old. I'm sorry. We have become butchers, not healers. I don't know if I can do this anymore, but if I stop, who will help them? One Marine later wrote, I couldn't forget the faces, eyes wide open, pupils dilated, staring into darkness even after death. They didn't look like soldiers anymore. They looked like souls that had been tortured out of their bodies. I've never been a religious man, but standing in that chamber, I believed in hell. Because I was standing in it. These weren't hospitals. These were charnel houses where medicine collapsed under the weight of endless suffering. The tunnels designed to shield life had become galleries of pain carved into stone. The Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, had become meaningless. Because harm was inevitable, suffering was guaranteed. All the doctors could do was try to delay death, and even that felt like cruelty. Now we arrive at the darkest chapter. The one that military historians still struggle to discuss without breaking down. The one that proves beyond any doubt that what happened on Okinawa wasn't just a battle. It was a tragedy of such immense scale that we're still trying to understand it 80 years later. The chambers of mass suicide. Japanese officers had spread their propaganda so effectively that trapped underground with dwindling supplies, entire groups believed death was the only honorable choice. But this wasn't just military philosophy. This was systematic psychological manipulation that turned entire families into willing victims of their own government's ideology. Parents were given grenades. Military officers distributed them like rations, handing them to fathers and mothers with simple instructions. One for the enemy, officers said. One for yourself. Don't let the Americans take you alive. Don't shame your family. Don't shame the emperor. Die with honor. Others carried vials of poison prepared for the moment when all hope was lost. Some families had drawn lots to decide who would use the grenades, who would use the poison, who would ensure that no one survived to face capture. Children as young as 5 understood what the grenades were for, what the vials contained. They'd been prepared for this moment, mentally conditioned to accept their own deaths as preferable to capture. And when American forces uncovered these sites, they found scenes that defied human comprehension. In one cavern, families sat together as if for a meal, arranged in circles, parents and children and grandparents, their bodies torn apart by explosions they'd triggered themselves. Small skulls lay in the laps of larger ones. Parents had held their children close in those final seconds, trying to provide comfort in the moment of annihilation. You need to understand what this means. These weren't combat deaths. These weren't soldiers killed in battle. These were families who'd huddled in darkness, who'd comforted each other, who'd prayed together, and then killed themselves because they believed it was better than facing the alternative. In another tunnel, the walls were smeared with soot, evidence of fire set intentionally before grenades ended lives. They'd burned their possessions first, everything they'd carried into the tunnels, family heirlooms and photographs, and anything that might survive them. They didn't want the Americans to have anything, and then they'd pulled the pins. The smell of burned flesh lingered for weeks after the detonations. American search teams had to wear masks. Some tunnels had to be sealed because the horror inside was too great to document, too disturbing to preserve. Better to close them forever, to seal the chambers and let the dead rest in darkness. The tragedy wasn't just in the scale, it was in the waiting. Civilians had huddled in darkness for days or weeks, listening to propaganda echo through their minds, convinced that capture meant fates worse than death. Survivors who escaped later confessed how neighbors begged one another to act quickly, how mothers sang lullabies to infants seconds before pulling grenade pins, how the last thing many children heard was their parents' voice saying, "Don't be afraid, we'll be together. Just close your eyes." One survivor, a young girl who'd been shielded by her mother's body and somehow survived the blast that killed her entire family, later testified about those final moments. She described how her mother had gathered all the children together, had told them they were going home to see their ancestors, had sung them a gentle song about returning to the earth, and then there was the sound of metal scraping metal as the pin was pulled, and then nothing. For the Americans who entered afterward, the silence was deafening. No gunfire, no resistance. Only the echo of choices forced by fear and fanaticism. These discoveries horrified even the most battle-hardened veterans. Men who'd killed enemies without hesitation, who'd fought in the most brutal combat of the Pacific War, stood in these chambers and wept. One officer admitted decades later, "Of all the battles I fought across the Pacific, it's the memory of women and children in those tunnels that haunts me most." We won the battle, We raised the flag, we secured the island, but what we found underground proved that everyone had already lost. There are no winners in that kind of war. There's just different degrees of losing. The tunnels beneath Okinawa claimed over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and somewhere between 40,000 to 150,000 civilians. The exact number will never be known because countless remains are still sealed in collapsed sections, buried forever in the limestone that was supposed to protect them. Some sections of the tunnel network have never been explored. Some entrances have never been opened, and maybe that's for the best. Maybe some horrors should stay buried. Recovery teams have been working for decades, slowly, carefully, recovering what remains they can. Every year, they find more. Bones, personal effects, prayer beads and student notebooks and family photos. Each item tells a story of someone who vanished underground, whose final moments were spent in fear and suffering, whose death was unnecessary and tragic and completely preventable. Archaeologists have described the bones as silent witnesses, locked in testimony against the madness of war. They found remains of entire families, skeletal evidence of parents holding children, of people who died clutching each other, seeking comfort in their final moments. The bones tell stories that survivors can't or won't, stories of suffering that language fails to capture. Today, if you visit Okinawa, you can still find tunnel entrances. Some have been preserved as memorials, carefully maintained with plaques explaining what happened here. Others are sealed with concrete permanent barriers marked with warnings not to enter. But locals know they're there. They know what lies beneath the pleasant-looking hills and forests, and locals whisper of strange sound. Echoes of weeping rising from sealed entrances on quiet nights, the faint thud of boots, as if soldiers are still marching through passages deep underground. The cries of children seeping from blocked entrances like memories that refuse to stay buried. Whether superstition or the island's memory bleeding through, the effect is the same. The tunnels are reminders of trauma too vast to bury, of suffering so immense that it seems to have stained the earth itself. The tunnels are reminders of trauma too vast to bury. They stand as monuments to the cost of fanaticism, to the price of propaganda, to what happens when governments convince their people that death is preferable to surrender. They remind us that the darkest chapters of war are often not the battles themselves, but what happens to civilians caught between armies, between ideologies, between powers that care nothing for their suffering. What those American soldiers found beneath Okinawa wasn't just evidence of war's brutality. It was proof of how far human beings can fall when fear and fanaticism drive them underground. It was evidence that the greatest horrors of war are not inflicted by the enemy, but by the choices we make ourselves, the lies we tell ourselves, the fears we allow to consume us. The earth itself became a tomb, and some nightmares, as it turns out, never see daylight. They linger in the darkness, waiting to be discovered, waiting to tell their stories to anyone brave enough to listen. If this story affected you, if it made you think about the true cost of war beyond the statistics, then share it. Subscribe for more untold histories, because these stories matter. They matter because they show us what humans are capable of, both terrible and noble. They matter because they remind us of the price of war, paid not just by soldiers, but by everyone caught in its path. And remember, the darkest chapters of our past are the ones we must never forget. Because beneath the surface of history in those pitch-black corridors lies a truth that still terrifies. In war, humanity itself can vanish into the shadows. And what emerges is not survival, it's silence.